Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Bolus. Unfortunately, he can't join us. He's in California. We're trying to bring him in. It was originally be by Skype. We're having some issues here, but I think hopefully it's going to work. Chris Bolus is co-chair of our Scientific Medical Advisory Committee, and he has been a dedicated physician volunteer for PSC Partners for many, many years. He's my go-to when I need when I have scientific questions or need some guidance on some of the things we're doing in our organization. Chris Bolus is professor and chief of the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. He completed his undergraduate education at the University of California, San Diego, and received his medical degree from St. Louis University. After completing his internal medicine training at UC Davis in 1993, he went on to fellowship training in gastroenterology and hepatology at Yale University. There he worked on the Human Genome Project with emphasis on cloning genes in the region of the hemochromatosis gene. In 1998, he returned to UC Davis as an assistant professor and established himself as an international expert in autoimmune liver diseases, specifically PBC and PSC. He has an active research program that focuses on three main areas: elucidating the underlying genetic and immunologic causes of PBC and PSC, testing new treatments for PBC and PSC, and improving testing and care of Asian Americans with chronic hepatitis B through the use of community outreach and personalized medicine. He's a respected educator and has served on the Gastroenterology Fellowship Program Director at UC Davis for over a decade, and he's the recipient of the Walter Trudeau Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Bolus is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, the American Gastroenterology Association, and the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease. Chris is a true friend of our organization. I'm glad to welcome him today. He's going to be talking about PSC Partners sponsored international research. So,
Katie, can you hear me?
He's there. Okay. He cannot hear us is the problem, but we can hear him. So.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. This is a bit odd for me since I can't see or hear you. So I'll assume you can hear me and see the screen. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. I just got back recently from a meeting in Oslo, which was sponsored by the European Association for the Study of Liver, or EASL, and it focused on biliary diseases, including PSC. It was a great conference with a lot of new science, and a large part of it devoted to translating those new scientific findings into new treatments for disorders, including specifically PSC. It was pretty nice because there were over 200 people in attendance from Europe, the US, Canada, and even several countries from Asia. And just as a preview, we'll be developing a similar meeting to be held in March through the ASLD in Washington, D.C. So something to look forward to in the near future. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about over the next 10 or 15 minutes is really related to about the role PSC Partners plays in sponsoring research through the Research Grants Program as well as the Patient Registry. And I can say that many of the people that were at this recent meeting have received funding through PSC Partners, and they were recognized during that meeting. And it really does play a vital role in moving this field forward and finding new therapies for PSC, which I think is what we are all interested in. So let me just start off by talking a little bit about the Scientific Medical Advisory Committee and our roles. And I think there really are two main issues that we deal with for PSC Partners. And the first is to essentially advise PSC Partners, the board, on the applications that come in for grants. And that's run by the co-chair of the SMAC, which is Richard Green. And then the other function we play is to assist in the PSC Partners Patient Registry from design, analysis of the data, and use of the data. And I do that along with Rachel, who plays really the central role in that registry. And along with myself, Greg Everson and Keith Linder help provide oversight as well to the registry. You can see there's a large number of people on the SMAC committee, and they come from not just the U.S. but also from Canada and Europe. So it's, I think, a very broad representation, which hopefully gives a very balanced view of the field. In terms of the applications, for those of you that aren't aware, there's an annual cycle of grants that are submitted. It's been going on since 2009. Currently, the grants are for up to $60,000 over a 2-year period. And the number of applications that are coming in are increasing. And I would say that they're increasing not only in number, but also in the quality of grants that are being received. You can see over the last 3 years, it's gone from 17 grant applications submitted up to 29 this year. They come from a range of investigators in terms of geography, interests, as well as what I think is most encouraging is it brings in new people from other fields that may want to start off a research program in PSC but don't have enough data to get a grant from a federal agency. And so this can be a great way to attract new investigators into PSC research. In terms of the review process, we use an NIH-style peer review. So this would, the way we review the grants, just for everybody's information, is very similar to a grant that would be submitted to the NIH is reviewed. We use the same scoring system. We have assigned a primary and secondary reviewer to each grant. Reviewers that have conflicts of interest are excluded from reviewing those grants. And the grants are reviewed based on several criteria. There's a significance factor, which is most important, and that is this grant and its potential findings going to move the field forward? Is it going to have an impact on patients? We also rate the investigators as someone that has a record of successfully completing research. Are they new? Are they a new young investigator that we want to encourage to go into PSC research? Is there innovation in terms of the science of the approach being taken? The approach itself, is it scientifically valid? Is it rational? And what's the environment like? Is this being done at an institution or a setting which is likely to be successful? So those are all the criteria that are used, and the primary and secondary reviewers assign an overall score to each grant, and then the members of the committee can then give a score based on those reviewers' comments and their scores, and then an average score is calculated, and the grants are ranked, and those recommendations then go to the board. In terms of the numbers of grants, I think it's really impressive what PSC Partners has done. You can see about $2.6 million over the course of the last 8 years have been used to fund grants related to PSC, which is just incredible. And you can see that the amount of funding has been going up in subsequent years. So these I think are really remarkable figures. In terms of the grants that are funded, I think they can be broken down into 3 large areas. There are grants that are submitted related to basic science, that is really understanding the basis of PSC, either at a genetic level or some cellular functional level, that may not directly translate into the benefit of patients right away, but is the only way that we'll be able to find new approaches to treatments for PSC. So a lot of these studies that initially were focusing on genetics, we're seeing a little less emphasis on genetics now that we've developed a lot of information on genetics. We know some of the genes that are involved. There's more focus on the microbiome now. Several studies in animal models trying to better understand approaches that might be taken to treat the bile duct injury, and then even cell-based studies. There are also clinical science studies, which range from anything from a clinical trial to understanding the epidemiology or natural history of PSC. And I think one of the most important areas, which I'll talk about in terms of the registry, is development of biomarkers. These are tests that help us predict how patients are going to do in the future. And they're really necessary for us to validate and show that they are meaningful, so that when we do clinical trials, we can measure biomarkers and show that if we have an improvement in a biomarker, it's likely to predict a improvement in patient outcomes. There are also some grants we've received increasingly now on sort of patient-oriented studies. These have included developing quality of life measures. So how can we determine if patients are doing better with PSC? Maybe not in terms of outcomes of liver transplantation or infections, but just in the way people feel. We know that people with PSC have impaired quality of life, but how do we measure that objectively? And these measures are very difficult to do, but they're very important, and they need to be validated and shown to be specifically applicable to PSC. And so there's increasing work in that area, and there's been some grant applications for that. And then also just patient education. How can we do a better job of educating patients about PSC, getting them the information that they need? And what comes of these grants? What are the benefits of having these grants? Well, of course, they often lead to publications and high-ranking journals for the scientific community. So they add to the knowledge base we have about PSC. They've led to presentations at many international meetings, including ASLD, EASL, and the most recent conference I was talking about in Oslo. And then I think perhaps even more importantly is that there's a return on investment in terms of leading to additional funding. So these grants, while they're significant in terms of dollar amounts, the real money comes through federal funding, either through the NIH or also EU funding. So really, even if one or two of these grants leads to a large $5 million NIH grant, you've got a great return on investment, and that's, I think, really key here. I just want to show a couple pictures here that I think these might have been tweeted out by others and PSC partners, but this was at EASL, just acknowledging a study that was funded in part by PSC partners, and then more recently in Oslo, again, PSC partners being recognized for their support of studies by the group at Yale and Padua. So that's I think the background in terms of the research grants, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the patient registry now. And I talked about this, I believe, last year at the New Haven conference and showed this. And I think it's important to recognize that these registries are really important in terms of moving any therapy into an approved state where we can actually prescribe it. If we think about the processes of the disease, we go from diagnosis to understand the natural history, and then we want to understand these biomarkers or surrogate markers so that we can get drugs approved and get new therapies. And where we're really stuck is with this biomarker or surrogate marker development. And just to illustrate what this means is that if you think about a disease, there's the onset of the disease at one time point, and sometime after that, we make a diagnosis. Now with PSC, that timeline is often delayed significantly. But even with PSC, from the time of diagnosis to some clinical outcomes, such as liver transplantation, there's generally about a 20-year time frame. And so if we're going to show that a drug is effective and wait for a clinical outcome, we'd have to do a study over many, many years with many, many patients, and it just wouldn't be practically feasible. During this time, there's also symptoms. So one approach to trying to show that a drug is effective is to show that it improves how people feel, that is, it improves the symptoms. And that's where these health-related quality of life, these patient-reported outcomes are really important to develop, so that if a medication or intervention improves how people feel, that also is of benefit, even if it doesn't change the clinical outcome. Even if it doesn't slow the disease progression to liver transplantation, at least patients are feeling better. Now, in terms of showing whether whether a medication or therapy improves clinical outcomes, what we're really looking at is trying to devise a biomarker, that is a marker that will help us recognize who's at greatest risk of developing a clinical outcome. So, for example, in diabetes, we use something called the hemoglobin A1C. That's a measure of sort of a glucose control. And if you have a higher hemoglobin A1C, you're more likely to develop complications of diabetes. Cholesterol would be another biomarker. If you have a high cholesterol, you're more likely to suffer a heart attack. And what's important is in both those cases that if you reduce those biomarkers, the hemoglobin A1C or the cholesterol, then in most cases you reduce the risk of the clinical outcome. And so you don't necessarily have to show that you reduce heart attacks or you reduce complications of diabetes to get a new drug approved. You just have to show that you improve that biomarker, because it's a good indicator that you'll eventually have better clinical outcomes. For PSC, we really don't have a biomarker like that. We've tried alkaline phosphatase. It's not clear that's good enough. There's FibroScan, which may be a good biomarker. There's a new blood test that's been studied called the Enhanced Liver Fibrosis Test, or ELF test, that looks good. So there are several here that are starting to look good, but we need to study more of them. And the only way to do that is to gather lots of information from lots of patients and do those tests to see which biomarkers are most accurate to predict outcomes. And until we have one of those, it's almost impossible for us to find a pathway to get drugs approved through the FDA or even in Europe through the EMA. So that's the main focus, and that's the importance of the registry. So in terms of who's in this registry for PSC partners, I just want to start first by congratulating everyone there that the registry now has reached over 1,000, which is really remarkable. These numbers I'm going to show you are based on about 850 of the first people that enrolled. You can see that about 3/4 of the participants come from the United States, but significant numbers, and increasing I would say, are coming from the UK, Canada, and other countries. We have patients in the registry that have confirmed their diagnosis by providing some medical information. That would be the majority of the patients in the registry. But regardless of whether patients have provided that information, the groups essentially look very similar. And they look similar to groups that we would normally see from a large academically run patient registry or study. The diagnosis on average is around 32 years of age, and it's about 9 to 10 years later that people have entered the study. Unlike other groups that have been studied, there's a lower prevalence of men, probably having to do with participation rates. But the frequency of IBD is about 75%. About 14 to 18% have had a liver transplantation. Probably a slightly disproportionate representation from whites in the database. And about 4% have reported some form of liver cancer. So what we've learned from the registry is, as I mentioned, the patients in this registry are very similar to those reported by academic centers. And I think this really just illustrates that a patient-run registry can be a valuable resource. It's reliable. The data we get is of good quality. And it provides access to people that otherwise may not be participating in registries because they don't live close to an academic center that's interested in PSC. We've also found there are differences in medication use if we compare North American patients versus European patients. Particularly in the US, we find more antibiotic use, more corticosteroid use, and more use of things like Remicade or Enbrel for treatment. And interestingly, when we first looked at the data, we found that there's less use of URSO in the US, but now we're actually seeing the same rates of URSO use. I think that had to do with the high-dose URSO study results and the reluctance to use it initially, but it's starting to be used more in the US than previously. So those are interesting things to find. And then also we find in terms of symptoms, this is a great resource for learning about symptoms. And what we've seen is more than 80% of patients in the registry are reporting fatigue, abdominal pain in about 3/4. Itching is very frequent at about 60%. And we do find differences in terms of symptoms that are being reported by where patients are living. Now, one of the things that often comes up is, why are there multiple registries? Is this just redundant, having a PSC partners registry or these other registries out there? And I think there are lots of reasons why there are multiple registries, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, because different investigators have different interests, they have different regulations, and we're studying different populations. So there's no reason why not to have multiple registries. There's also funding issues in terms of how do we fund these different things. If we just have one incredibly large registry, it would just be too difficult to fund, and funding these registries at academic centers is quite expensive. And by having more registries, there's more access to participation for patients. This is just a list of the many registries that are out there. I'm not going to go over them in detail, but they all have slightly different formats or designs, different interests and goals. But there has been a very strong effort to coordinate these registries. We just completed a process of harmonizing what we call common data elements between these 5 databases. So our North American registry, a European reference network, Dutch PSC database, UK PSC database, and the International PSC Study Groups database. So that while we may have sort of different databases, we will have a large set of common items that we'll collect data on using the exact same definitions and methods of collection. So in the end, we can pool all our data together to then have a joint PSC data set to discuss. So that was actually quite a large effort, but we've just completed it. And so I think that was a major accomplishment and will really help us in the future as we move forward. So in terms of patients and which registry you should sign up for, I think sign up for any that you're offered and you feel comfortable signing up for. You can always participate in more than one registry. Just make sure you let the group requesting you to register to know that you've signed up for another registry. And so finally, let me just finish up here by saying that the grant funding has been really quite successful over the past 8 years now. It's attracted new investigators, new studies that otherwise wouldn't have occurred without the funding from PSC partners. There's been a lot of new knowledge. It's been presented and disseminated, and it's led to additional grants, so that a nice return on investment. In terms of the registry, again, I think it's really remarkable that there's over 1,000 participants in there now. I think there's really some great data. It's being recognized as a resource for others to use. We just actually did a recent survey, some of you may have participated in, asking about a study using a specific diet to treat PSC and what patients thought about it. How palatable would that be to participate in? Also, it's open to everyone, so there's no restrictions geographically or otherwise in participation. And so we encourage everyone to participate, especially the younger men who seem to be missing from the database. So, thank you very much. I can't hear you, I can't see you, but it's been a pleasure, and I'll be happy to answer questions through the chat room that Katie's going to enter them into. So, thank you.